The hospital room was eerily quiet as the machine beeped steadily, the rhythmic sound of life hanging by a fragile thread. Ellen, a loving mother, wife, and grandmother, lay motionless in her bed, a look of deep serenity on her face. She had fought a long, exhausting battle with her health, but in her final moments, she had no idea that the greatest betrayal of her life was about to unfold. Her son, Mark, the one person she trusted more than anyone, had done the unthinkable. Just days before her death, without consulting her, he had sold the family home, the house that held generations of memories. Ellen had been incredibly protective of that home. It was the place where she raised Mark, where she and her late husband had shared so many moments of love and loss. That house symbolized the heart of the family, and now Mark had sold it without a second thought. He claimed it was for financial reasons, but that explanation never seemed quite right. Something about it felt off. Ellen had always trusted her son, but as the days passed and her health worsened, she began to feel that something wasn't right. In her final days, she had become more withdrawn, more reflective. Had she been wrong about Mark? Had he been hiding something from her? It was these nagging thoughts that plagued her, even as her strength waned. As Ellen's breath slowed, she whispered her final words, words that no one thought would mean anything more than a simple farewell. "I should have never trusted him." Those were the last words Ellen spoke before the silence took over. It was a quiet room, but those words echoed in the minds of those who were present. They were a revelation, a secret that had been buried for far too long. Those words, though seemingly simple, would turn into the key that unlocked a family's deepest secrets. What happened next would shock everyone. No one could have predicted that Ellen's passing was just the beginning of a shocking journey, a journey that would uncover betrayal, deceit, and a web of lies that stretched far beyond the family home. Her death, though tragic, set in motion a quest for justice, and her last breath would soon become the catalyst for exposing the truth. The question lingered in the air. What had Mark done and why? Who was he really? And what would Ellen's final words reveal about the son she had loved unconditionally? Had she seen something she hadn't wanted to admit? Or was it all a carefully orchestrated plan that no one had ever suspected? As we follow the clues Ellen left behind, a web of betrayal will slowly unravel, leading to a truth so disturbing that it will change everything. The hidden motivations and the buried secrets about Mark's involvement in the sale of the house would soon come to light. But before that, let's step back and look at the family's history. The family that seemed perfect on the outside had more cracks than anyone could have imagined. The lies were deeper than anyone could understand. Sometimes it takes death to reveal what's been buried for far too long, and Ellen's final moments were the beginning of this painful but necessary truth. The aftermath of Ellen's death sent shockwaves through the family, but it was only the beginning. Her funeral was somber, filled with people who mourned her passing, each one offering condolences, but none of them knew what was truly unfolding behind the scenes. As Ellen's children gathered to sort through her belongings, no one could have anticipated the shocking discovery that awaited them. When the time came to go through her things, Mark insisted that everything be handled quietly. After all, he was the one who had been closest to his mother. But in the midst of sorting through paperwork, Sarah, Ellen's daughter, stumbled upon something unexpected, a letter tucked away in the back of an old drawer, partially hidden beneath stacks of photographs. At first, it appeared to be just another piece of correspondence, but upon closer inspection, It was a letter from Ellen herself. The handwriting was unmistakable. She had written it only a few weeks before her death, seemingly with a sense of urgency. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, but it clearly held a message. As Sarah read through it, her stomach twisted in knots. Ellen had written about her growing concerns over Mark, her suspicions that he was hiding something from her. "I fear that I may not have long to live, and I worry that Mark will do something to harm our family," the letter read. "I've seen a change in him, something in his eyes. I don't know what it is, but I'm afraid it will tear us all apart." The weight of the letter hit Sarah hard. Could it be that her mother had known something about Mark's actions all along? But why hadn't she said anything before? Why hadn't she trusted someone else to protect her? But the surprises didn't stop there. As Sarah continued to sift through the papers, she came across a will, one that was different from the one Mark had made her sign years ago. This was a private document, handwritten, with instructions that left everyone stunned. Ellen had written that the house was never to be sold, under any circumstances, unless her death was confirmed. She had made specific arrangements for the house to be passed down to Sarah. Why hadn't Mark mentioned this before? The family home, the house that had been a cornerstone of their lives, was supposed to stay in the family, and yet he had sold it behind everyone's back. Had Ellen known what Mark was planning? Was she trying to send a message from beyond the grave? As Sarah began to piece together the clues, she realized the extent of the betrayal. Mark had been planning this sale for months, and no one had suspected it. The financial transactions, the paperwork, all of it had been done under the radar without any consultation with Ellen. And now, with the discovery of the letter and the will, Sarah realized that her brother had deceived everyone. He had played his part in this betrayal carefully, using the legal system and their mother's declining health as tools for his own gain. The discovery of Ellen's handwritten will was the first step toward uncovering the truth about what had really happened. But as Sarah's heart sank, she couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. There was so much more to uncover, and with every new document, every new clue, the web of lies seemed to grow ever more tangled. As the family gathered once more, the question became clear. Who could they trust? How far had Mark gone to hide the truth, and what were the consequences of his actions? Ellen's secrets were just beginning to unravel, but it would take more than just a letter or a will to truly uncover the full extent of the betrayal. The revelation of Ellen's hidden will and the unsettling letter from her own hand left Sarah with a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. It was clear now that Mark's betrayal wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a deeper, darker story that had been brewing for years. But what had truly happened between Ellen and her son? The answers lay buried in the past, in the untold stories that no one had dared to speak about. Sarah knew that in order to fully understand the magnitude of the betrayal, she would have to dig deeper. She needed to uncover the past, Mark's past, Ellen's past, and everything in between. The house was gone, but the memories it held still lingered, and they were the key to unraveling the mystery. The first place Sarah turned was the family archives, a collection of old photos, letters, and documents that had been carefully stored in the attic for decades. It wasn't a place anyone liked to visit. The attic was dark and musty, filled with boxes of forgotten things that only served as reminders of a past that many preferred to forget. But Sarah knew that if she wanted to uncover the truth, she would have to face it. As she sifted through the old photographs, one caught her eye. A picture of Ellen, young and full of life, standing beside a man Sarah didn't recognize. He had his arm around her, smiling at the camera with an air of confidence. The photo was from the time when Sarah was just a child, but it was one that she had never seen before. Ellen had never spoken much about her early life, and Sarah had always assumed her mother's past was just as quiet and uneventful as her present life had been. But this photo was different. The man beside Ellen was familiar in a way Sarah couldn't explain. He had a look of cold calculation in his eyes, the kind of look that unsettled her. As Sarah stared at the photo, a chilling thought crossed her mind. Could this man be connected to Mark's behavior? Had Ellen been involved in something from her past that had somehow resurfaced to destroy her family? She had to find out more. The next step was to track down Ellen's old friends, people who had known her before she married and settled into a quiet life in the suburbs. After making a few calls and visiting some familiar faces, Sarah met with Jill, a woman who had been one of Ellen's closest friends in her younger years. Jill had always been a bit of an enigma to Sarah, someone who seemed to know a little too much about the family, but never spoke openly about the past. Over coffee at a small cafe, Jill's eyes grew heavy with regret as she recounted the past. She revealed that Ellen had once been deeply involved with someone whose influence had affected the course of her life in ways that would only be understood in hindsight. Jill spoke of Peter, a charming, manipulative man who had been part of Ellen's life in her youth. The relationship had ended abruptly, but the scars it left behind were still fresh. Ellen was never the same after him, Jill said, her voice soft and filled with sorrow. He used her, manipulated her, and then vanished without a trace. She was never quite the same after that. Sarah was stunned. Could Peter be the key to understanding Mark's betrayal? Could his presence in her mother's past have shaped Mark's actions? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in ways she hadn't anticipated. The more Sarah dug into Ellen's past, the more she realized that there were shadows lurking in every corner of their family history, shadows that had never been fully addressed. Ellen had never spoken much about Peter or the impact he had on her life, but it was clear that his influence had shaped her in ways she couldn't have imagined. As Sarah continued her investigation, it became apparent that Mark's betrayal wasn't an isolated act. It was the culmination of years of unresolved issues, hidden resentments, and the quiet manipulation of a family that had been damaged by secrets. The question now was, how much of Mark's behavior had been shaped by the past, and how much of it was his own doing? One thing was certain, Sarah was getting closer to uncovering the full story, and the deeper she went, the darker it seemed to get. Every new discovery only led to more questions, and the answers were becoming more and more difficult to find. The more Sarah uncovered about her mother's past, the more she began to question everything she thought she knew about her family. Ellen had always been a woman of few words when it came to her past, and Sarah had always accepted that silence as normal. But now, each piece of evidence she uncovered seemed to reveal a hidden narrative, one that had been buried under years of silence. The photographs and the stories Jill shared about Peter were unsettling, but they were just the beginning. Sarah's next step was to search through the rest of Ellen's personal belongings, hoping that there might be more clues, something tangible that could shed light on the truth. One afternoon, as Sarah was going through a box of old keepsakes in the attic, she found an ornate jewelry box tucked away at the bottom of a dusty chest. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it stood out in the way it was hidden. Sarah had never seen it before, and there was something oddly significant about the way it had been placed. She opened it carefully, unsure of what she would find. Inside were a few pieces of jewelry, a ring, a bracelet, and a delicate locket. At first, the jewelry seemed harmless, just sentimental pieces of the past, but as Sarah lifted the locket, she noticed something odd. There was an inscription on the inside, barely legible, but still visible enough to catch her attention. For Peter, my forever love. Her heart raced. The locket had to be connected to Peter, the man Jill had described as a toxic influence in Ellen's life. But what did this mean? Ellen had never mentioned him again after their relationship ended. Sarah had no idea that Peter had ever been such an important figure in her mother's life, let alone that she still kept a piece of him close to her heart all these years later. But the discovery of the locket was only the beginning. As Sarah continued to sift through the jewelry box, she found something far more disturbing. A letter, hidden beneath the jewelry, written in Ellen's handwriting. Sarah's hands shook as she unfolded the paper, unsure of what she was about to read. It was dated several years ago, long after Peter had left, but it revealed something truly chilling. Mark will never forgive me for this, but I know it must be done. I have to protect him, even if he can't understand why. I have to make sure that no one, not even Peter, can harm our family again. If anything happens to me, Sarah must know the truth. She will be the one to see it through. The letter was vague, but its meaning was clear. Ellen had been keeping secrets, and these secrets were tied to Mark's actions. What had Mark done, and what role did Peter play in it all? Why had Ellen felt the need to protect Mark from something that seemed so deeply connected to their past? Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The pieces were slowly starting to come together. Ellen had been protecting her family, especially Mark, from something darker, a legacy of manipulation and betrayal that spanned generations. But why hadn't she told anyone? Why had she kept this hidden for so long? As Sarah pieced together the fragments of Ellen's past, it became clear that Mark's betrayal wasn't just about money or power. It was about a much deeper, more sinister truth. Ellen had known something about Mark, something that had driven her to make difficult decisions. Decisions that would have long-lasting effects on everyone involved. The locket, the letter, and the strange warnings from Ellen all pointed toward one conclusion. The family's history had been shaped by forces far beyond what anyone could imagine. But the more Sarah uncovered, the more she realized that this was just the tip of the iceberg. What had Mark done to cause such a rift? And how was Peter still involved in their lives, even after all these years? The shadows of the past were no longer just whispers. They were coming to life, and Sarah was determined to find out the truth, no matter the cost. The locket, the letter, and the disturbing connection between Peter and her mother left Sarah with more questions than answers. The deeper she dug, the more she realized that her family's picture-perfect image was nothing more than a facade. The quiet suburban life they had all grown accustomed to was built on layers of deceit, and now the truth was starting to seep out in fragments. But Sarah couldn't stop. She couldn't let go of the growing suspicion that the betrayal within her family went beyond Mark's sale of the house. Ellen's last words, her final confessions, had hinted at something far darker, something that involved everyone in the family. As Sarah sat in the attic, surrounded by the remnants of her mother's life, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest. It was time to confront Mark. She could no longer sit idly by, wondering what was happening behind closed doors. Mark had to know that Sarah was onto him, and yet a part of her was terrified of what would happen when she finally faced him with the truth. But before she could confront her brother, Sarah knew she had to speak to David, her father. Despite the years of silence between them, he was the one person who might know more about Ellen's history with Peter and more about Mark's motivations. David was not an easy man to reach. He had always been a quiet, reserved figure, more concerned with his career than with his children. But as Sarah sat across from him at the kitchen table one evening, she could see the strain in his eyes. He knew something. He had always known something. "I'm sure you've been going through Mom's things," David said without preamble, his voice tight. "And I'm sure you found a lot of things that don't make sense." Sarah's heart sank. How much did he know? "You're right," she replied cautiously. "I found a letter. A letter from Mom, and a locket. There's something I don't understand, Dad. Why didn't you ever tell me about Peter? Why did Mom keep him such a secret? David's face grew pale, and for a moment, he looked like he might say something that would change everything. But he hesitated, glancing away as if searching for the right words. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. Peter wasn't just some man from her past, Sarah, David said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He was part of something much bigger, something dangerous. He had a way of getting into people's heads, manipulating them. Your mother was too trusting, too kind-hearted. She believed in the good in people. But Peter, he used her, and Mark was just a pawn in it all. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. What do you mean? How was Mark involved? David looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. Mark didn't know the whole truth, Sarah. He was too young to understand at the time. But when he grew older, Peter's influence started to show in him. Your mother never wanted to tell you. She didn't want you to know how much Peter had twisted things. But Mark, over the years, he became more like Peter than she ever wanted to admit. She tried to protect him from it, but David's voice trailed off, as though he could no longer bear to speak the words. But Sarah could already feel the answer swirling around her, waiting to be fully revealed. The more she learned, the more she realized that Mark's betrayal wasn't just a one-time act. It was the result of years of manipulation, a twisted legacy that had been passed down, one generation after the other. You're telling me, Sarah said, her voice trembling, that Mark sold the house because he was influenced by Peter? That he didn't even care what it meant to Mom? David looked pained. I'm not saying that, but Mark's actions didn't come out of nowhere. He learned from the people who hurt your mother, from the people who used her. And as much as we tried to shield him, he couldn't escape it. The house, the money, it's all part of the same pattern. The weight of David's words hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Mark wasn't just a greedy son. He was a product of something much deeper, something much more sinister. And the house, the family home that meant so much to Ellen, had become the final symbol of that betrayal. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. It was about making sure that Ellen's legacy was erased, that the past was buried. Suddenly, everything started to make sense. The sale of the house, the hidden will, the letter, all of it was part of Mark's plan to sever his ties to the past, to erase Ellen's influence once and for all. But Sarah knew that she couldn't let him get away with it. Mark had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now she had to confront him. She had to expose the full extent of the lies that had been hiding in the shadows for so long. As Sarah stood up from the table, the weight of what lay ahead settled heavily on her shoulders. She had come too far to turn back now. The family she had once believed in was a lie, and it was time for the truth to be revealed, no matter the cost. The tension in the air was palpable as Sarah prepared for the most difficult conversation of her life. The more she uncovered about her family, the darker the truth became, and now it was time to confront Mark. He had played a dangerous game, one that no longer allowed room for silence or denial. With every piece of evidence, the weight of his betrayal grew heavier, and the lies that had been concealed for so long could no longer remain hidden. Mark had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in their mother's eyes. But Sarah's discovery had shattered that illusion. The Mark she once knew was no longer the same person. His ambition, his greed, and his manipulation had transformed him into someone she barely recognized. As she made her way to Mark's house, Sarah felt the gravity of the situation. The family had been torn apart by secrets and lies, and now, the time had come to force the truth into the light. She wasn't sure how Mark would react, but she knew she couldn't let him get away with what he had done. Not after everything their mother had gone through, and certainly not after discovering the extent of the damage he had caused. When Sarah arrived at Mark's house, she didn't waste any time. She walked straight in without knocking, her mind set on the confrontation that awaited. Mark looked up from his desk, surprised to see her standing in the doorway. There was a moment of tension between them, the silence thick with the weight of everything left unsaid. "I know what you did," Sarah said, her voice cold but steady. "I know you sold the house, and I know why." Mark's expression shifted from confusion to defensiveness, and his eyes narrowed. "You don't know anything, Sarah," he said, his voice tight with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know everything," she countered, stepping forward. "The will, the letter, the house. You can't hide from the truth anymore. Mom knew what you were planning. She knew what you were capable of, and she tried to protect you. She left me everything for a reason. She trusted me, Mark." The anger in Mark's eyes intensified. But there was something else there. Fear. He had thought he could bury the past, erase his mother's influence, but it was clear now that Sarah was the one who would stand in his way. "You don't know what you're saying," Mark spat, his voice rising. "That house wasn't hers to keep. It was mine, too. She wasn't thinking straight. You don't understand what I had to do. You're just like her. Weak, sentimental, holding on to things that don't matter. I was doing what was best for us, for the family." For a moment, Sarah just stared at him, disbelief flooding her system. "Best for the family?" she repeated, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "You sold the house to line your pockets, to sever all ties with her. You think I don't know what's going on, Mark? You think I don't understand why you've been doing all of this?" Mark took a step forward, his jaw clenched, his face twisted in frustration. "You don't know anything about me. You never understood the pressure I was under. I had to do it. I had no choice." "No," Sarah replied firmly. "You had a choice. You chose to betray Mom. You chose to betray this family. And you chose to believe that the truth wouldn't catch up with you. But it has. And now, it's time for you to face the consequences." Mark's eyes darkened, and for a split second, Sarah saw something she hadn't expected. Regret. But it was fleeting, and in its place, a mask of anger quickly took its place. "You think you're going to fix this, Sarah? You think you're the one who's going to expose me? You don't even know the full truth. I've spent years protecting this family from the mess Mom left behind. She didn't know what she was doing, and neither do you." Sarah's heart raced, but she didn't back down. "I know more than you think, and I know that you've been hiding something. You've been covering for yourself, making sure you're the only one who benefits. But I'm done. This ends now." Mark's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, Sarah feared he might lash out physically. But just as quickly as the anger came, it dissipated, replaced by a resigned, almost defeated expression. He dropped his gaze, his shoulders sagging in a way that made Sarah's heart ache, but she knew better than to feel sympathy. This was the consequence of his actions, the unraveling of a life built on lies. "You really think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" Mark muttered, his voice hollow. "You've got no idea what's coming. You'll never be able to stop what's already been set in motion." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "I don't need to stop it. I'm going to make sure the truth comes out. You can't run from your past forever, Mark, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows who you really are." With that, she turned and walked out of the house, leaving Mark standing there, speechless. The battle was far from over, but Sarah had taken the first step in reclaiming the family's truth. The lies that had festered for so long were finally being exposed, and Mark could no longer hide behind the walls he had built for himself. The road ahead would be difficult. The family was fractured, and there was no going back to the way things were. But Sarah was determined to see this through. She owed it to her mother, to the memory of everything Ellen had worked for, to uncover the full story and bring the truth into the light. The confrontation with Mark had left Sarah with more questions than answers. Though she had finally forced him to admit the truth of his betrayal, it was clear there was more to the story than he had revealed. Mark had tried to justify his actions, painting himself as a victim of circumstance, but Sarah knew better. She wasn't just dealing with a son who'd sold his mother's house. She was dealing with a man who had orchestrated an entire scheme to manipulate everyone around him, and who was willing to destroy the family in the process. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to piece together everything she had learned so far. Ellen's hidden will, the letter, the locket. Each of these items had told her part of the story, but the final piece of the puzzle still eluded her. If Mark was behind the sale of the house, was he also behind something more sinister? Had his manipulation gone further than just financial greed? There was one thing Sarah couldn't shake: her mother's death. It had always seemed so sudden, so unexpected. Ellen had been ill, yes, but she had seemed stable in the days leading up to her passing. Yet, in those final moments, as she had whispered her last words about Mark's betrayal, something about the timing felt too perfect. It was time to investigate further. Sarah's first step was to look into the medical records surrounding her mother's death. She knew that, as her next of kin, she had the right to access the information, but the process felt like walking into the lion's den. She made her way to the hospital where Ellen had passed, feeling a sense of dread settle over her as she approached the front desk. When she explained her situation, the receptionist hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the back office before she nodded. "I'll need to get approval from the attending physician," she said, but after a few tense moments, Sarah was handed a file. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, looking for any indication of foul play. The records were mostly routine. Ellen had been admitted for a chronic condition that had worsened over time, but one note stood out: administered extra sedatives at the request of the patient's son, Mark Stewart. Sarah froze. Her mind raced. Why would Mark request additional sedatives for their mother? Ellen had never mentioned such a request, and it seemed out of character for her to ask for something like that. Had Mark intentionally increased her mother's medication to hasten her death? Was his betrayal more than financial? It was a calculated move to make sure she was out of the way. As Sarah stared at the page, she felt the weight of what she was reading settle in. This wasn't just about a house or money. This was a premeditated move, one that had been carefully orchestrated to eliminate Ellen before she could fully realize what Mark had done. Sarah's mind went back to the confrontation. Mark had been defensive, but also strangely resigned. It was as if he knew she was getting closer to the truth. And now, with this new information, Sarah could finally see the full extent of his deception. Mark had taken advantage of his mother's declining health, using his position as her primary caretaker to manipulate the situation. By administering extra sedatives, he had ensured that Ellen wouldn't be lucid enough to fight back, to see the full scope of his actions. He had sold the house and emptied the family's savings, all while his mother was slowly fading away. The betrayal had gone far beyond money. It was about control, power, and removing anyone who might stand in his way. But now, Sarah had the evidence. It was time to confront him again. When Sarah returned to Mark's house, her anger and determination were palpable. She had never felt more certain of her actions. Mark had taken everything from them, everything from Ellen. And now he would have to face the consequences. This time, she wasn't walking in with questions. She was walking in with a plan. Mark was sitting in his living room when Sarah arrived. The moment she stepped inside, he looked up, his eyes narrowing. The usual deflection and excuses were gone. He knew Sarah had found something, and his expression shifted from defiance to apprehension. "You've been busy," he said flatly, not even trying to hide his unease. "I know what you did," Sarah said coldly, holding up the medical records. "You killed her, Mark. You used your position to push her out of the way so you could take everything. The house, the money, the power. You poisoned her, and you think you can just walk away from it." Mark's face went white, and for the first time, Sarah saw genuine fear in his eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice cracking. But there was no confidence in his words anymore. "I didn't kill her." "You've got it all wrong." "No," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "You killed her. You killed her so you could have it all. And now I'm going to make sure you pay for it." Mark's facade finally cracked, and he stood up, his hands shaking. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It was the only way. She wouldn't have understood. She was too weak to see it, to understand what I had to do. You would never get it. I had to make her disappear." The raw emotion in Mark's voice made Sarah's blood run cold. He truly believed what he was saying. He didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as someone who was doing what was necessary, even if it meant destroying his own mother. "You're wrong," Sarah said softly, her heart heavy with the weight of it all. "It's over now. I have everything I need to make sure the truth comes out. You'll face the consequences for what you've done." As Sarah turned and walked away from the house for the second time, the finality of it hit her. Mark was no longer the brother she once knew. He was a man who had destroyed everything for his own gain. And now, the family's darkest secrets would finally be exposed. Sarah stood outside Mark's house, the weight of her discovery sinking in. She had confronted him, uncovered the depths of his betrayal. But there was still one crucial piece of the puzzle left, those final moments with Ellen. She knew Mark was the one who had been with her mother during the last days of her life, but who else had been there? Who else had witnessed the subtle changes, the tensions, the undercurrent of fear? Sarah needed to hear from those who had been closest to Ellen during those final days. It wasn't just about seeking vengeance. It was about finding the truth, the whole truth, and understanding exactly how deep Mark's deception ran. Her first stop was Rachel, the nurse who had cared for Ellen in her last weeks. Sarah had seen Rachel several times when visiting her mother, and the nurse had always seemed kind and professional. Rachel had been one of the last people to see Ellen before her passing, and Sarah hoped she could offer some insight into the atmosphere surrounding Ellen's health in those final days. Rachel's apartment was on the outskirts of town, quiet and unassuming, much like the nurse herself. When Sarah knocked on the door, Rachel answered with a tired smile, but her eyes were immediately wary. She knew why Sarah was there, and she knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. "I'm glad you came by, Sarah," Rachel said softly, stepping aside to let her in. "It's been a difficult time for everyone." As they sat down on the couch, Sarah could see that Rachel wasn't just talking about Ellen's death. There was more here, an undercurrent of something hidden, something that had been kept quiet for far too long. "I know this must be hard for you," Sarah began. But I need to know what really happened during those last days with my mother. Mark was with her, but he was involved in so many things. I'm not sure I can trust him. You were there. You saw what was going on. What do you know? Rachel's face tightened, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then she looked directly at Sarah, her eyes filled with regret. I wish I could tell you that everything was normal, that Ellen was at peace in those final days, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. But the truth is, it was strange. There was something about her decline that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the illness. It was how Mark handled everything. Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. What do you mean? What was strange? Rachel paused, her hands ringing nervously in her lap. The sedatives. I administered the usual dosage, but a few days before Ellen passed, Mark insisted on increasing the dosage. At first, I thought maybe he was just being overprotective, but the way he insisted, it didn't feel right. And Ellen, she seemed drugged, sedated beyond what was necessary for her condition. She wasn't herself, Sarah. The blood drained from Sarah's face. Mark made that request, didn't he? She asked, her voice barely audible. Rachel nodded, her face a mixture of guilt and sorrow. He did. He said she was in too much pain, that she couldn't fight anymore. But looking back, I think he just wanted her to go quietly, without protest. She was never that sick, not to the point where she needed that much medication. I don't think she was even aware of what was happening to her. Sarah felt the air in the room grow colder. The pieces were falling into place. Mark had engineered Ellen's death, not just by selling the house or manipulating her, but by controlling her medical treatment. He had ensured she was too drugged to fight back, to understand what he was doing. His betrayal ran deeper than money. It was about control, about removing the only obstacle standing in the way of his plan. Did Ellen ever say anything to you? Anything about Mark? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Rachel hesitated before speaking, as if weighing her words carefully. There was one thing, she said slowly. A few days before she passed, Ellen asked me if I thought Mark would ever forgive her. She seemed scared, like she knew something was coming, but she couldn't quite put it into words. I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but now, I think she knew. She knew what he was capable of, and she was terrified. Sarah felt her throat tighten as the realization hit her. Ellen had been aware of Mark's betrayal, but she had been too weak to stop it. And in those final moments, when she had spoken her last words, she had been trying to warn Sarah, trying to give her a chance to stop him. The truth was clear now. Mark had planned everything, from the sale of the house to his mother's untimely death. He had manipulated every situation to his advantage, and Ellen's fears had been justified. She had known her son would turn on her, and she had tried to protect Sarah from the consequences. I can't believe it, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. I can't believe he did this to her, to all of us. Rachel placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, offering what little comfort she could. I know this is a lot to take in, but you're not alone, Sarah. You've got the truth now, and that's all that matters. As Sarah left Rachel's apartment, the weight of the confession hung heavy in her heart. Ellen had known the truth, but now Sarah was the one who had to carry the burden of that knowledge. Mark had murdered his own mother, slowly, methodically, and with a cold, calculated mind. But Sarah wasn't done yet. She had the truth now, and she was going to make sure it was heard. Mark's deception wouldn't go unpunished. The family's darkest secrets were finally being exposed, and Sarah would stop at nothing to see justice done. The truth about her mother's death had shattered Sarah's perception of everything she had once believed. Mark, the brother she had trusted, the son Ellen had given everything for, had turned out to be the one who'd caused the most pain. His betrayal, orchestrated with such precision, ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. But Sarah knew there was one final layer to expose: the twisted manipulation of emotions Mark had used to further his deceit. Mark had always presented himself as the loving son, the devoted caretaker. Ellen, in her final years, had leaned heavily on him. She trusted him to make decisions, to manage her affairs, and to protect her. But now, Sarah could see that the truth was far darker. Mark had played the role of the devoted son, but in reality, he was the architect of his mother's undoing. He had used the very love Ellen had for him to manipulate her, to weaken her resolve, and ultimately, to hasten her death. Sarah's thoughts turned back to the days leading up to her mother's death. Mark had kept her in the dark, maintaining an image of concern and affection. But it was all a ruse. He had convinced Ellen that he was the only one who could care for her, that the rest of the family was too distant, too preoccupied. In the name of love, he had isolated her, making her feel as though he was the only one she could rely on. But Sarah knew that this false devotion was all part of Mark's grand scheme. He had used Ellen's trust to secure his inheritance, to lay the groundwork for his betrayal. And all along, he had made her believe that he was the only one who truly understood her needs, her fears, her vulnerabilities. He had manipulated her into a corner where she could no longer fight back. As Sarah prepared to take the next step, to confront Mark once more, she felt a sense of resolve settle over her. She couldn't let him get away with it. Not now. Not after everything she had uncovered. It was time to expose the depths of his deceit, to show the world what he had done in the name of love. But before she confronted him, Sarah decided to speak to Father Thomas, the priest who had been a close family friend. Father Thomas had known Ellen for years, and he had been present during some of her most difficult times. Sarah wondered if he had seen the subtle changes in Ellen, if he had witnessed any of the manipulation that had been happening under the surface. She met Father Thomas at the church, the familiar scent of incense and polished wood filling the air as they sat together in the quiet sanctuary. He had always been a calming presence in her life, but today, his gentle demeanor did little to soothe her troubled heart. "I need to know the truth, Father," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with an unspoken weight. "You knew my mother well. You saw her at her worst, when she was vulnerable. Was there something you noticed? Something about Mark that didn't seem right?" Father Thomas's expression softened, his gaze filled with empathy. "Sarah, I've known you and your family for a long time, and I can see that this is tearing you apart. What I'm about to say won't be easy to hear, but you need to understand." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts before speaking. "I watched Ellen's decline closely. She was always a strong woman, and when Mark took on the role of her primary caregiver, I thought it was a relief for her. But over time, I noticed a shift in her. She became more withdrawn, more dependent on him, even when she didn't need to be. Mark was always there, always reassuring her that she needed him, that she couldn't trust anyone else. At first, I thought it was just his way of being a good son, but as the weeks went by, I began to see something different." Father Thomas sighed, his eyes heavy with the weight of the knowledge he carried. Mark wasn't just looking after her, he was controlling her. He made her believe that she couldn't make decisions on her own, that she was incapable of seeing what was really happening. And as her health deteriorated, that control only deepened. He used her vulnerability to manipulate her into a corner, and she was too scared to fight back. She trusted him completely, and he used that trust to his advantage. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. So, he manipulated her, just like he manipulated all of us. Father Thomas nodded gravely. Yes, Sarah. Mark used the love Ellen had for him to make her feel weak, to make her think that she needed him more than anyone else. He isolated her, made her believe that everyone else was too busy or too distracted to care. And in the end, it was that love that he twisted into something dangerous. He used it to take control of her life, and ultimately, her death. Sarah sat in stunned silence, the truth sinking in with a heavy thud. Mark had used love, the very thing that should have united their family, to tear it apart. He had manipulated Ellen's affection, twisted it into a weapon he could wield to get what he wanted. I need to make sure this all comes to light, Father, Sarah said, her voice firm. No one can get away with this. Not after everything he's done. The truth needs to be heard. Father Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression one of deep sorrow and understanding. You are strong, Sarah, and you are doing the right thing. The truth will come out, and justice will be served. It may take time, but you are not alone in this. With those words, Sarah left the church, her mind focused on one thing: exposing Mark for the liar he was, for the monster he had become. She would not let him get away with using her mother's love as a weapon. It was time for the world to know the truth, and for Mark to face the consequences of his betrayal. The days that followed Sarah's meeting with Father Thomas felt like a blur. Her mind was consumed with the truth about Mark and the damage he had done, not just to their family, but to the memory of her mother, whose life he had manipulated and stolen from her. Sarah had made the decision. She would take everything she knew, all the evidence she had uncovered, and expose Mark for who he truly was. The world needed to hear Ellen's last words, and Sarah was the one who would make sure they didn't die with her. She couldn't let Mark's web of lies continue, and she certainly couldn't let him silence the truth. Ellen's final words, "I should have never trusted him," echoed in Sarah's mind. She had spent so many years looking up to Mark, believing in his goodness, but now she understood that those words weren't just a fleeting thought. They were a dire warning, a truth Ellen had known deep in her heart, but had never been able to say aloud until it was too late. Sarah knew she had to act fast. Every moment she waited was a moment Mark could use to cover his tracks, to twist the narrative in his favor. She needed to be the one to control the story. She arranged a meeting with her lawyer, a trusted ally who had helped her with her mother's estate. Together, they would begin the process of exposing Mark's crimes, not just to the family, but to the world. The plan was to file a formal complaint, to make the evidence public: Ellen's will, the medical records, the testimonies from Rachel and Father Thomas. But it wasn't just about legal recourse. This was about revealing the truth, no matter the cost. You're doing the right thing, Sarah, her lawyer said as they went over the details of the case. You have a strong case here, and with the evidence you've gathered, it's only a matter of time before Mark is held accountable. But we need to make sure we're prepared for what's coming. He'll fight this, of course. He'll try to discredit you, paint you as the one trying to tear the family apart. You need to be ready for the fallout. Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. I'm ready. He's already destroyed everything. If this is the only way to make things right, then so be it. Later that evening, Sarah stood in front of her mother's grave, the wind rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. It was a quiet place, peaceful, but for Sarah, it had always been a place of comfort. Now, it felt like the beginning of something far more tumultuous. Ellen was gone, but her spirit, her voice, would not be silenced. I'm going to make sure they know the truth, Mom, Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You won't be forgotten. I won't let him erase you. I promise. As she left the graveyard, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of determination settle over her. She had the final word now. Mark had silenced their mother in her final moments, but Sarah would make sure her voice was heard loud and clear. The next few weeks were a blur of legal battles, emotional confrontations, and public exposure. As Sarah's lawyer filed the complaint and began to gather the necessary evidence, the media got wind of the case. Mark's carefully constructed image as the devoted son began to crumble piece by piece as the truth came to light. The articles, the interviews, the court hearings, all painted a picture of betrayal and manipulation. Mark had thought he could bury his secrets, but Sarah was pulling them into the light, where they would never be forgotten. One night, as Sarah sat with her lawyer reading through the court documents, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment, then opened it. It was from Mark. "You don't know what you're doing. If you go through with this, you'll destroy everything. You'll destroy yourself." Sarah stared at the message for a moment, the weight of Mark's words hanging in the air. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't the frightened, confused sister she had once been. She was something stronger now. Someone who had uncovered the truth and would fight to the very end to see it through. "You're right, Mark," she typed back, her fingers steady. "I'm going to destroy everything you've built, and I won't stop until you face the consequences of what you did." The final word had been spoken. There was no going back now. Mark's betrayal had started a chain of events that could not be undone. He had thought he could control the family, that he could erase the truth, but Sarah was proving him wrong. And as the battle in the courts raged on, Sarah could feel the weight of her mother's final words pressing forward, louder and more powerful than ever. Ellen's truth had been hidden for too long, but now it would be heard. Mark's empire of lies was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the legal battle against Mark continued to intensify, Sarah found herself digging deeper into her mother's past, determined to unearth every shred of truth. The complaints were mounting, the media was buzzing with the scandal, and Mark's carefully crafted image was unraveling at a pace that made his head spin. But Sarah knew that there was more to uncover, more that could permanently seal his fate. There was one final place Sarah hadn't searched yet: her mother's diary. Ellen had always been a private person, not one to share her thoughts easily. But Sarah knew how much the diary had meant to her mother. It was the one place Ellen had written down her innermost feelings, her deepest fears. Over the years, Sarah had often found the diary tucked away in a drawer, always carefully hidden, always locked. She never dared to open it when her mother was alive, respecting her privacy. But now, Sarah felt she had no choice. She had to know what Ellen had written, what secrets the diary held. What had Ellen known all along? What had she been trying to tell her, even in her final moments? The small leather-bound book was sitting in the same drawer where Sarah had found the letter and the locket. The diary was fragile, its pages yellowed with age. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before carefully unlocking it. The first few pages were filled with Ellen's handwriting, neat and elegant, chronicling the mundane events of her life: shopping trips, family gatherings, small victories and losses. But as Sarah read further, the entries became darker, more intense. One entry, dated just months before her death, stood out to Sarah. "I'm so afraid of what's coming. Mark keeps telling me I'm not well enough to handle things on my own, that I need to rely on him more. I'm not sure I can trust him anymore. He's changed. I don't know if he's doing this for me or if he's doing it for himself." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her mother had known, hadn't she? Ellen had sensed something was wrong with Mark, but she had been too afraid to act, too trusting in the son she had raised. But as the entries continued, Ellen's fear grew. "He's becoming more aggressive. I can feel it, even when he's not saying anything. The way he talks about the house, about money, he's obsessed with it. I think he wants to control everything. I've been trying to write down everything, in case something happens to me. I'm afraid he'll take it all from me, and I'll be too weak to stop him." The words seemed to leap off the page. Ellen had known that Mark was preparing to betray her. She had been writing down her thoughts, her suspicions, for years, trying to leave behind a record of the truth. She had suspected him all along, and now Sarah knew it. Mark's treachery had started long before Ellen's death. It had been brewing for years, buried beneath layers of manipulation and deceit. But there was one last entry, one that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was dated just days before Ellen passed away. "I'm so tired, and I don't know if I can fight him anymore. He's convinced me that I'm better off letting him handle everything. He's the only one who can protect me now. But I know deep down that I can't trust him. I'm afraid. If I die before I can make it right, please tell Sarah. Tell her the truth. Mark has been planning this for a long time. He's been using me to get everything he wants. I don't think he'll stop until he's taken everything. Please, Sarah, don't let him win." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she read the final words. Ellen's last request had been to make sure the truth came out. Mark had used her mother's trust, her love, to secure his future. And now, Sarah had all the proof she needed. The final puzzle piece had fallen into place. Ellen had known everything, and she had tried to warn Sarah. She had tried to leave behind a trail of breadcrumbs, but it was too late. Mark had already sealed his mother's fate. Now, Sarah had to honor her mother's last wish, to ensure Mark could never erase the truth. The diary, the medical records, the letters, and the testimonies, everything had come together. Mark had used his mother's trust to manipulate her, to take everything from her. But Sarah wasn't going to let him get away with it. With renewed purpose, Sarah contacted her lawyer. "We have everything we need," she said, her voice steady. "Mark's manipulation, his betrayal, his plan to take everything from us, it's all in these documents. We can bring him down. It's time for him to face the consequences." Her lawyer, equally resolute, agreed. "This is the final nail in the coffin. We'll take it to court. We'll expose him for who he truly is." The court case was no longer about money or property. It was about justice, about making sure Mark could never hurt anyone again. Sarah was prepared to do whatever it took to see that her mother's final words were honored. As Sarah looked down at the pages of the diary, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The truth had been uncovered, and now it was time to fight for it. Her mother's final request would not be ignored. The truth would come out, no matter how hard Mark tried to bury it. The days following Sarah's discovery of her mother's diary were a whirlwind. Armed with the damning evidence of Mark's betrayal, Sarah prepared herself for the most intense battle of her life. The court case had become personal. Mark was no longer just her brother. He was the man who had robbed her family of its peace, of its truth. Sarah had the evidence, the truth that had been hidden away for so long, and she was determined to make sure that Mark could never get away with what he had done. With the diary, the medical records, and the testimonies from Rachel and Father Thomas, Sarah and her lawyer crafted an airtight case. Mark had orchestrated his mother's death, manipulated the will, and sold the family home, all while deceiving everyone around him. But this case was about more than just money or property. It was about justice for Ellen, for her final moments, and for the family Mark had torn apart with his lies. The trial was set to begin in a few weeks. As Sarah sat in the conference room, her lawyer laid out the strategy. "We've got the facts. Mark will try to twist the narrative, play the victim, but we're prepared. The medical records, the diary, they'll show that Mark manipulated Ellen, that he pushed her to a place where she could no longer make decisions for herself, and will have witnesses who can testify to his actions. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the situation press down on her. The truth was on her side, but Mark was a master manipulator. She had no doubt he would stop at nothing to keep the truth from coming out. But this time, he wouldn't win. The courtroom on the day of the trial was filled with tension. Sarah sat at the front, her eyes fixed on the door as Mark entered. He walked in confidently, a smirk on his face, as though he still believed he could talk his way out of this. His lawyer, a slick and experienced man, immediately set to work, trying to discredit Sarah and paint her as someone trying to destroy the family. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mark's lawyer began, "this is nothing more than a family dispute." A daughter, upset over the sale of a house, trying to drag her brother through the mud with baseless accusations. There is no evidence that Mark had anything to do with his mother's death. His only crime is caring too much for her, wanting to protect her in her final days. Sarah clenched her fists. Mark's attempt to paint himself as a devoted son was pathetic. He had done everything to manipulate their mother, everything to control her life and her money. But Sarah had the evidence, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Her lawyer stood up, his voice steady and authoritative. "We will prove that this was not an act of love, but an act of manipulation. That the defendant, Mark Stewart, systematically took advantage of his mother's declining health to take control of her life, her finances, and ultimately, her death. We will show that Mark Stewart is not the victim here. He is the perpetrator." Sarah felt a surge of hope as her lawyer laid out the case. One by one, the pieces of evidence were presented. The medical records that showed Mark's request for extra sedatives, the diary filled with Ellen's words of fear and suspicion, the testimony from Rachel, the nurse who had witnessed Mark's overbearing control, and Father Thomas's account of Ellen's isolation. The truth was undeniable. Mark's defense crumbled as the evidence mounted against him. He tried to deny everything, to claim that his actions had been in his mother's best interest. But it was clear to everyone in the room that he was lying. The jury listened intently as Sarah's lawyer spoke, presenting the undeniable facts. Mark had not been protecting Ellen. He had been controlling her, manipulating her, and pushing her to the point of no return. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. The room fell silent as she spoke. "My mother loved us both," Sarah began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "She trusted Mark. She believed in him, but I now know that he took advantage of that trust. He manipulated her, took control of her life, and in the end, he was the one who caused her death. My mother knew something was wrong, but she couldn't fight it. She tried to warn me, but it was too late." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she looked toward the jury. "I'm here today, not just for me, but for my mother. She deserved better. She deserved to die with dignity, with love, not at the hands of the person she trusted most. I'm here because she asked me to make sure the truth came out. And I'm here to make sure that Mark is held accountable for what he did." There was a long pause as Sarah's words hung in the air. It was clear that her testimony had struck a chord with the jury. They had seen through Mark's facade, and they had heard the truth, loud and clear. The trial dragged on for several more days, but the outcome was inevitable. Mark's lies were exposed, his manipulation laid bare. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning with a verdict. "Guilty." The word echoed through the courtroom, and Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't over yet. There would still be legal battles ahead, and Mark would likely appeal. But for the first time, she felt like justice had been served. Mark was taken away in handcuffs, his once confident demeanor shattered. He had underestimated Sarah, underestimated the power of the truth. But the real victory for Sarah was not just the conviction. It was the knowledge that her mother's voice had been heard, that her mother's final words had not been ignored. The truth had come out, and Mark's reign of manipulation was over. The trial was over, and the verdict had been delivered. Mark Stewart, once the golden son, was now facing the consequences of his actions. As the weight of his guilt settled on his shoulders, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of justice, though it was tempered by the deep scars left on her family. The truth had been exposed, and Mark was now where he belonged, behind bars. But while the courtroom had delivered its verdict, Sarah knew that the battle wasn't over. The legal process would continue as Mark appealed his conviction, and there were still questions to answer. As much as Sarah felt a sense of relief, she also understood that the true cost of Mark's betrayal wasn't just the loss of their mother. It was the dismantling of the family's legacy, the irrevocable damage he had done to their lives. It wasn't long before Sarah was faced with the next challenge, confronting Mark in a final, private meeting. The request had come from his lawyer, who claimed Mark wanted to speak with Sarah before the sentencing phase. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. What could Mark possibly have left to say? But she knew that this meeting would be the final piece in her journey. A chance to look him in the eye, to hear him confess everything, and to let him know that she had won. When Sarah entered the sterile, cold meeting room in the courthouse, Mark was already sitting at the table, handcuffed, his once confident demeanor completely gone. He looked defeated, older somehow, as if the weight of the truth had aged him prematurely. But Sarah saw through the act. This was a man who had manipulated everyone, including himself, into believing he was untouchable. Now, the facade was shattered. "Sit down, Sarah," Mark said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance. He gestured to the chair across from him. "I just want to talk. I need you to understand. I never wanted things to go this far." Sarah looked at him with disdain, but she sat down, meeting his gaze. "You're a liar, Mark. You manipulated Mom. You manipulated all of us. You didn't do anything out of love. You did it for control. You used her, you used me, and now you're going to pay for it." Mark swallowed, the anger that had once burned in his eyes replaced by a look of resignation. "I know you hate me now, but you don't understand what I was trying to do. I wasn't trying to hurt Mom. I thought I could protect her. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. You don't know how much pressure I was under." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Pressure? You were under pressure to steal from your mother, to control her life, to make sure that she never saw through your lies. You took everything from her, Mark. The house, the money, her dignity. And now you're trying to justify it?" Mark's eyes darted away from hers, and for the first time, Sarah saw a crack in his armor. "I was scared," he muttered. "She was fading, and I didn't know how to handle it. I thought that if I could just take control of everything, it would make it easier. I thought I could make everything go the way I wanted. I never thought it would end up like this." "You were never trying to make it easier for her, Mark," Sarah replied, her voice cold and unwavering. "You were trying to make it easier for you. You thought you could control everything, but now look where you are. You've lost everything. Your family, your freedom, and there's no going back." Mark's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought I could keep everything together. But now I've lost everything, and it's all my fault." Sarah watched him for a moment, her heart a mixture of anger and pity. She had spent so many years looking up to him, trusting him, believing that he was the one who would protect the family. But now, she knew the truth. Mark had never been the protector. He had been the destroyer. "I'm done with you, Mark," Sarah said, standing up. "There's nothing you can say that will change what you did. You're going to pay for what you've done to Mom and to this family. And I'm going to make sure the truth is heard, no matter what." As Sarah walked out of the room, she felt a sense of finality. This was the last time she would ever have to face Mark. The last time she would hear his excuses, his justifications. He had finally been exposed for who he was. A man willing to sacrifice everything for control. Willing to destroy the very people he claimed to love. The path ahead was still uncertain, but Sarah knew one thing for sure. Her mother's memory would be honored, and Mark's reign of manipulation was over. She had fought for the truth, and she had won. The truth had come out, and Mark's empire of lies was crumbling before him. The court case against Mark had been a harrowing experience, but for Sarah, it was only the beginning of her fight for justice. The trial had exposed Mark for what he truly was, a master manipulator, willing to destroy everything to get what he wanted. But as Sarah continued to push forward, there was a bigger truth at stake. This wasn't just about Mark's guilt. It was about the system of control he had set up, the web of deceit he had woven around their entire family, and how deeply it had poisoned everything they had once held dear. Sarah had made her peace with the fact that the damage was done, but she knew that it wasn't just Mark who had to face justice. There were others who had aided him, even if unknowingly, in perpetuating the lies that had destroyed her family. Peter, the man from her mother's past, had been the catalyst for much of Mark's actions. Though he hadn't been physically present in the final stages of Ellen's life, his shadow loomed large over everything. Sarah knew she couldn't let Peter slip through the cracks. She couldn't let Mark's conspirators hide behind their silence. She needed to bring everything to light, every last detail, every hidden motive, and she needed to do it before Mark's defense team could manipulate the narrative again. As Sarah and her lawyer prepared for the next phase of the battle, holding those who enabled Mark's betrayal accountable, the tension grew. The investigation into Peter's role, as well as the conspiracy surrounding Mark's plans to manipulate Ellen's will, was far from over. But Sarah was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. She had already uncovered the heart of the matter. The truth, as painful as it was, could never be hidden again. The trial had left Sarah with a sense of resolve she hadn't known she had. The focus now was not only on Mark, but also on the wider conspiracy that had led them here. If Mark had manipulated his way into Ellen's life and financial control, then Peter's influence had paved the way for that manipulation. It was time for Sarah to expose everything, to ensure that no one who had participated in this horrific scheme went unpunished. Weeks passed as Sarah's team dug deeper. There were interrogations, depositions, and interviews that uncovered new information at every turn. Peter's connection to Mark was far more significant than anyone had first realized. Not only had Peter been an influential figure in Ellen's life, but he had also acted as a guiding force in Mark's own life, shaping his ambitions and desires. The twisted legacy of control began to unravel before Sarah's eyes. She could now see the full picture. Peter had been more than just a past lover. He had been a predator who had preyed upon Ellen's vulnerabilities, using her love to manipulate her decisions. After his departure, he left a void that Mark filled with his own version of control, manipulating Ellen's emotions and distorting her trust. The more Sarah uncovered, the more it became clear that Mark had learned from Peter. His tactics had evolved, but the core principles of manipulation remained the same. It was time to confront Peter. Sarah knew that it wouldn't be easy, but she also understood that exposing the full extent of the conspiracy was the only way to ensure that Mark and his enablers paid for their actions. It was a confrontation she had been dreading, but it was one that was necessary to bring everything into the light. She arranged to meet Peter at a neutral location, a small cafe in the city. When she arrived, Peter was already sitting at a corner table, looking as though he hadn't aged a day since the photos Sarah had seen. His icy demeanor was still the same manipulative gaze that had once captured Ellen's heart. But now, Sarah saw him for what he truly was. A predator who had ruined their family for his own gain. "Sarah," Peter greeted her, his tone cold, but his smile remained intact. "It's been a long time. I didn't expect to see you here, of all places." "I'm sure you didn't," Sarah replied, her voice hard. "But I didn't come here to relive old memories. I came here because I need you to understand what you've done, what you and Mark did to Mom, to me." Peter's eyes flicked briefly to the door, as if considering making a quick exit, but he stayed seated. "You're upset, Sarah. I understand that. I know this has been a difficult time for all of you, but you need to understand what Mark did, he did out of love. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone." Sarah's anger flared. "Love?" she repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "What you and Mark did wasn't love. It was manipulation. It was control. And you both destroyed our family." Peter's expression faltered, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw a flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, beneath his cold exterior. "You don't understand, Sarah," he said softly. Ellen never truly understood the decisions she was making. She trusted me, and I thought I was protecting her. She couldn't see the bigger picture, and neither could Mark. "But I did what I thought was right." "No," Sarah cut in, her voice rising. "You didn't do what was right. You did what was best for you, what was best for your ego. You used my mother, and then you helped Mark do the same. You never cared about her. You only cared about what you could control." Peter's facade finally cracked. "I did what I had to do," he muttered. "I loved her, and so did Mark. He just couldn't see it until it was too late." Sarah leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "You ruined her, and you ruined me. You both thought you could get away with it, that no one would ever know the truth, but I'm making sure everyone hears it." Peter fell silent, and for the first time, he seemed vulnerable, a man stripped of the power he once held. Sarah had exposed him, and there was no going back now. As she walked out of the cafe, Sarah felt a sense of closure wash over her. The final confrontation had happened. Mark and Peter were no longer untouchable. The empire of lies they had built was crumbling, and she had been the one to bring it down. The trial was coming to a close, and Mark's sentencing was near. Sarah had won. Her mother's last words would not be forgotten. The truth had been exposed, and justice would be served. The courtroom had grown quieter with each passing day. The truth had come out. The legal process was drawing to a close, and Sarah stood at the precipice of a new chapter in her life. Mark had been convicted, and Peter's involvement had been exposed. The family that once seemed so perfect had been shattered, and Sarah had been the one to piece the broken fragments back together. But as the final day of the trial arrived, Sarah felt a sense of bittersweet closure. She had fought for justice, for her mother's memory, and for herself. Mark had been sentenced, and Peter was no longer a shadow in their lives. The power of their manipulation had been broken, and now it was time for Sarah to heal. The courtroom was packed with people, some with smiles of victory, others with silent contemplation. But Sarah only had eyes for the one person who mattered most: Ellen. The judge's gavel echoed in the room, and the final sentencing was handed down. Mark would serve a long sentence, and Peter would face legal consequences as well. There was no escaping the truth now. Justice had been served, but the emotional cost had been high. As Sarah stepped out of the courtroom, she felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The weight she had carried for so long, the guilt, the anger, the grief, began to lift, little by little. She had won, but she had also lost so much along the way. The family she had once known, the brother she had once trusted, was gone. In his place, there was only a hollow space, a painful reminder of the betrayal that had unfolded. But despite everything, Sarah couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. She had reclaimed her own life. She had reclaimed her mother's memory. And now, she could finally begin to rebuild what had been lost. Sarah visited the family home one last time before it was sold. The house that had once been filled with memories now stood empty, a shell of its former self. But as she walked through the rooms, her steps slow and measured, she found a strange sense of peace. The house no longer held the weight of Mark's lies. It was just a building, a place where memories had been made, and where, now, they could finally be honored. She sat down in the living room, the place where she and her mother had spent so many hours together, talking, laughing, sharing stories. It was quiet now, but in Sarah's heart, the echoes of those memories would never fade. They were hers to keep, and no one could take them away. With the final chapter of the trial behind her, Sarah knew that her journey wasn't over. The road to healing would be long and difficult, but she was no longer alone. She had the strength to move forward, to find peace within herself, and to honor the legacy of the woman who had raised her with love and integrity. As Sarah left the house for the last time, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had fought for her mother's memory, for the truth, and for herself. And while Mark's betrayal would never be forgotten, it had no power over her anymore. In the end, it was not revenge that Sarah sought. It was peace, the kind of peace her mother had longed for in her final days. And now that peace was within reach. The family she had lost would never be restored, but Sarah had come to understand that healing wasn't about going back to what once was. It was about moving forward, about embracing the future with an open heart. She was no longer the girl who had looked up to Mark, the girl who had trusted him blindly. She was Sarah, a survivor, a daughter, and a woman who had finally found the strength to stand on her own. As she walked away from the empty house, Sarah knew that she had finally reclaimed her life.